Hey everybody, this tutorial is going to talk about how to create our third-person template and convert that into a side-scroller, because I didn't see that inside of the new template settings inside of Unreal 5. So I just wanted to make my own and show you how you can convert it into that. Now this is actually a revised version of a video that I made earlier this year, and I had to remake it and kind of like reorganize it because they came out with the new input system and it kind of messed up some stuff. So this version includes a new input and it should be a cleaner overall walkthrough, and hopefully you enjoy it. I like side scrollers and I want to be able to create those inside of Unreal, and this will get you a template that will allow you to start creating some stuff. Hope you enjoy and hope you make some really cool things from it. So we're inside of Unreal. We've chosen the third person template, so we should be able to drop a third person character in the map. But what we want to do is we want to create a side scrolling game type by using that third-person controller and just putting it on two axes. So instead of being able to walk all around and jump and whatnot, we want to look at it from a side view, and we only want it to go up and to the side. Primarily what we want to do right now is just do our major game setup and talk about our game mode and how we're spawning and all that before we even get into the character controller. So that's what I'm going to do inside of this video, is we're going to set up our overall game and our project. So first off, we have a lot of extra stuff here. I'm going to go ahead and delete a lot of the extras. So over here on our playground, we can select that. We'll right click our folder, delete. We also don't need a lot of this stuff over here, like all these ramps and circles and things. We can always recreate that later if we want. So I'm just going to go around and delete all this stuff in my map, these series of blocks. I'll keep my lighting, but I'm going to highlight these folders, hold shift and right click, edit, delete. Okay, we are going to keep our player start. Mainly I'm just getting rid of a lot of my level geometry, and if you'd rather select it and delete it, that's fine. I'm going to keep my floor and I'm going to keep my back wall, I think. So first off, look over here at the forward direction over here. See if we do our red handle like that, our X is moving. We want our red arrow to be pointing in the forward direction, all right? So we want our Z to be up and our X to be our side. So we want our character to move along this axis right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete these side walls like that. We'll probably delete the text as well. I'm going to keep this back wall, and I'm going to take my player start and I'm going to zero out the Y right here. In this game type, I want to keep my Y at 0 so that it's really easy to put everything on the axis that we want to move along. In a side scroller game, we want it to be, in this one plane right here, this plane of gameplay. So I'm going to keep my Y 0 just so I can very easily align everything. So now I'm going to take my wall, I'm going to move it back. That you can see that I'm getting this bad indicator, meaning that there's nothing on the floor or that it's intersecting with the floor. So let's move our floor back some. Let's actually move it back even further, just like that. So that's hidden. We could always reshape that later if we want, but I'm going to come over here and I'm going to pull it up slightly. All right. Okay, so we have our wall and we have our floor, and what's really important is our player start is Y0, and the X and Z is, wherever we want to spawn it. Actually, we can move our plane over here if we want, and let's make sure that we zero out the Y on that. Anything that we want to align with the gameplay plane, we want to zero out on Y, but you can also see that, the pivot over here is kind of weird. So I can actually move that over there and that's not really a problem. And we'll delete out some of these. So delete, 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 delete. Delete all this out. So if you want to drag select inside the viewport, you can hold Control and Alt at the same time. You can select, make sure that you don't select the sky sphere though, so we can hold Control and deselect there. Or you could click and hold Control and click one at a time if you want. Either way, but we're going to select these objects and hit delete. But again, make sure you don't accidentally select something in the background like the sky sphere and delete that. Otherwise, just undo. Post-process volume, we will keep that as well. This is all our lighting stuff up here. Ooh, all right. So we have our basic scene setup. Let's see, there's nothing over there. We have a floor, a wall, a ramp. We can group this together inside of a folder. If you click, hold shift, and then once we have this selected, we can hit the create a new folder. We'll call this level geo or something. Okay, so we can keep that grouped. I think we're good. Now, the important thing is our player start is 0y, and then the X and Z is just however you want to position it. And we have some kind of level geometry. We could, scale this up if we like by holding R. Okay, we have our level set up, but now it's time to talk about the overall game structure and how we're going to organize things from the top down. First of all, with our third-person blueprint, if you open this up over here, you're going to see a third-person down here in blueprints, the third-person character. Now, by the way, I also did create my project with starter content. If you did not, you can always hit the add button and you can either add feature or content pack. You can import assets or whatever, like add feature or content. You can import the third person or whatever. If you did not do this in your project, or you can also click on starter content and import that. So I'm just using the starter content so that I have some prototyping materials. So little explosions and shapes and whatnot, but you could also create your own if you want. But that's where I'm coming from. So I have the third person character in here. You're also going to see some other things like BP underscore third person game mode. I'm going to customize all this myself because I want to take this and make a side scrolling game. But the other thing is I don't want to do a lot of work on this specific controller and then accidentally import something else that just overrides all my work, right? I want to take this and make a separate copy of it. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create my own folder. So over here in content, right click, go to new folder, and we'll call this SS Game. Something to let us know that this is our side scroller, separate from the other ones. And if your project gets a lot bigger than this, you can start to reorganize, like, you can separate out your starter content into something else or your characters and, whatever. For now, I just want something that lets me know this is where all my custom content is. So I'm going to go down to blueprints. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to right click and duplicate the third person character so I can customize this to be my own. So right click, duplicate. We'll call this BP underscore SSCharacter for side scroller. So this is a duplicate of this version, but we're going to customize this one to actually make it a side scroller character. Now, anytime you see a star on your assets right here, it means that we've done something that is not saved into the project. So we can just click the save all and you can see it created a lot of things here and we deleted some things and whatnot in our map. We'll click save selected, make sure that we represent that. And we will drag this over, this new BP underscore SS character over into SS game. And we actually want to move it here, not make a copy. Otherwise, we'll start to get confused. So move. So we'll see that over here. Let's also save our map. So we'll click File, Save Current Level As. We'll choose SS Game. And let's name it SS underscore Sandbox, I think would be more appropriate. Now we have our character that is customized, our sandbox, and these are separate from the provided materials. The other thing that we need is our game mode. I'm going to, in here, right click, choose blueprint class, and now it's asking what I want to create. I'm going to create a brand new game mode base. Okay. Now our game mode is going to allow us to customize a lot of very specific things, which I'll show you in a second, but click game mode and call this BP underscore SS game mode. Again, I'm going to hit save all, save selected. Sometimes if you don't save your assets and you have a crash, it can make some really weird error connection things. If I were to double click my game mode, over here in my classes, inside of this BP underscore SS game mode, the game mode will help us determine what are all the specific systems that are related to this game mode that we assign. And that sounds a little bit weird, but let me X out of this real quick. Each of our levels can define a game mode in it. So you could imagine that this is our side scroller game. The game mode in our side scroller might be different than the game mode in our main menu, or the game mode in our capture the flag, or the game mode in our rail shooter or whatever. our game mode is going to determine the type of player pawn that spawns, the type of controller we have, the type of HUD we see, all that. And so for our side-scrolling level, we want to define what that game mode is. So if you, again, double-click this to bring it back up. If you don't see this, you might see the open full blueprint editor. You can click that. This is just a very simplified view. Our game session, right? We could customize the type of game session. This is the persistent game that travels with us, and we can save information too. Our game state, this is like the intro cutscene, the round being played, the exit, game state, whatever. The overall game state. Our player controller, this is our representation of the player in the scene. So for example, our player can exist separately from our player character, right? Our player can press the backspace button to reload the level even after our player character is defeated and doesn't exist in the scene, right? Our player is very different from the character our player controls. And that can be kind of a weird concept to think about if it's your first time thinking about that. Our player state is any of the information related to the player, not just the player pawn, or sometimes I just call it the player character, the unit that the player is controlling. For example, our player could have a certain number of lives. So our player has 3 lives, but our player pawn, right, our default pawn class, our player pawn may have health that is independent of the number of lives. It doesn't know how many lives it has. The player owns the lives and the score, but the player pawn or the player character has the health and ammo and whatever. All this stuff we can largely keep the same, but we will customize this as we keep going. And our game mode is what defines all the controllers and larger types of things that we use for our gameplay. So anyways, let's talk about what we do want to customize. For this game type, I'm going to create a side-scrolling player controller, and we'll customize that. I'm going to create a side-scroller, let's see, default pawn class, and we'll customize that. And then we will also have our side-scroller game mode. I think that'll be good for now. We may end up creating more as we go on, but for now, I think that's fine. So a side-scroller player controller and a side-scroller default pawn. So this is going to be the character that we create in our scene. So let's go ahead and create those. Right-click, blueprint class. So first of all, we'll create a new player controller. Okay. This is BP underscore SS player controller. Hit save all. Save. And remember, this is the player that is giving input into the game, not the player pawn, the thing that's moving around in our game, the little character that's moving and jumping, whatever. That's our player pawn. Our player is the larger concept of the player interacting with the game, right? We can destroy the player pawn, but the player still exists if they're putting in things inside of a keyboard. Okay, so that's our player controller. We already created our player pawn over here. And more specifically, this is a type of character, which is a more specified version of a pawn. So a character is just a pawn that has a lot of extra functionality for movement and whatnot. All right, so that means inside of our game mode over here, when we define the side-scrolling game mode, we want to keep all the stuff by default, but we want the player controller to be, click this drop down, our BP SS player controller, and we want our default pawn to be our BP underscore SS character. Okay, not the third person. This is the duplicate that we made because we're going to make changes to it. Again, we're working like really high level architecture right now, just the setup. We'll compile, we'll save. So when we assign this game mode to a particular level, then that level will use the side-scroller player controller and the side-scroller character when it spawns in, when we press the play button. We'll close that. And I think this is good for now. Again, we can mess with UI and HUD and whatever and define that for this game mode or whatever. But I think this will give us the basic building blocks. So the last thing to do is to assign this game mode that uses this side-scroller player controller and this side-scroller character inside of this level. So the question is, where do we do that? So there's 2 different locations you can do. You can either assign it in this level specifically, or you can assign it in the project to use as the default. Now, if you have a game where you have multiple side-scrolling levels, it might make sense to assign that as the default. So let me show you where that would be. If you click in Edit and you go to Project Settings, and you're looking for something called Maps and Modes. Now there's two things I can assign in here. The first thing is the default game mode. If it doesn't know or it's not assigned, what do we want to assign to it? I'm going to click the drop down and choose BP_SS. So if the majority of our maps are side-scrolling games, like our side-scrolling setup, then we want that to be our default. Not required. We can set this map by map, but by default, we want the side-scrolling setup. So we'll set that game mode there. The other thing is, what do we want our map when we load the Unreal Engine to be? Well, we don't want the third-person map anymore. We duplicated and made it a separate map, right? So let's choose our startup map to be SS_sandbox map. All right, and game default map. In a lot of games, you might have your main menu or your load screen or whatever. For this, I'm going to choose the SS sandbox map. And you'd probably want to change this later if you had a more polished level that isn't a sandbox. But just to show you these two things, you probably want to set up as your new map that you're working out of. So the three things that we set up here is our game mode, our startup map, and our default map. Close that out. Save. Okay, so that's our default setup inside of our project settings. One other thing that I want to test is in our world settings, if we were to set map by map what the game mode was, we can go into our world settings button over here. If you don't see this, you can actually go to window, where is that? World settings right here, and you can pop up that panel. But if you go to world settings and you scroll down a little bit, you're going to see game mode. Game mode override allows you to choose a different game mode than the default, which remember, we just set our default as our side scrolling. We can actually override that so that in the different maps that are not the default, we could actually choose a different one. We can see that our game mode override here is the third person. We actually don't want that. We created a brand new game mode that we want to use. So click the drop down there and choose blueprint_SSGameMode. Or you can choose none, which will just use the default game mode, right? So we're going to choose none because we want this to default to the one that we set in project settings. But if you did not set something in project settings, it's really important that you actually just choose blueprint_SSGameMode. This is a little bit redundant if I were to leave it as SSGameMode, but just to prevent errors and make this easier and more error-proof, I'm going to leave this here. But if you did set it in the project default, you shouldn't need to choose that. You can just choose none. Right? But I'm going to choose this just in case it causes issues for anybody. We'll hit Control-S to save. Now, if we hit the play button, and you look inside your scene, you can see that it is spawning our character at the player start, right? And if we hit the, I'm hitting the Windows button, but you can also hit Shift F1 for our mouse cursor. Scroll down. The character that was spawned in our scene is the BPSS character because we assign this to the SS game mode. So if it is spawning the third person character, then you did not do something correct. If it is not using the SS game mode, you did not do something correct. Make sure that when you hit the play button, you are seeing these three things here, our SS character, SS game mode, and our SSPlayerController, so that then when we continue to customize these things right here inside of Blueprints, then we know that we're customizing them the correct things. Otherwise, you're editing assets that are not even in the scene, right? And obviously, it's not going to appear to be working. So once you get this far and you see the new custom assets that we made duplicated off of the old assets, then we can continue to define our game. So make sure that you see this when you hit play, and you should be ready to continue. All right, so the next thing that we have to do is we have to fix the camera. So if I hit play, you can see it isn't very much like a side scroller because our camera can just move all around. What I really want to do is I want to lock the camera kind of like this, so that when I move side to side, it will actually work like a side scroller. Press escape, exit out. So I don't have my content drawer docked. If you do it this way, you can always bring it up real quick with Control Space. So if I go into my character controller, if you don't see this window, you may want to go to the event graph and these tags up here. I'm not going to really talk about them yet, But if you go to the event graph on our BP_SSCharacter, remember this is our new one, not the old third person one, right? This is the new one that we created. If you come into our SSCharacter, you're going to see all of the input that gets connected to the functionality. And so what's happening here is our camera is receiving controls, but we really just don't want it to move at all. We want it to be static. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to get rid of the camera input. So I'm just going to select the camera input and select delete. So we don't want to receive any camera input on our character. In older versions of Unreal, this would look a little bit different because this is using the new input system. So this stuff up here, this just connects the newer enhanced input into the character controller. You don't really need to mess with any of that. We'll mess with the movement in a little bit, and this is the jump. But the main thing is we only want to delete out the part with the camera. So if this looks any different in the future, just delete the camera part. So if we hit compile and we save and we hop back in, now it should be a static camera, but it's still not going to be quite what we want. So let's test it out. Okay, so you see we can move around and we can't really control the camera, but it's not moving. And that's kind of what we want. We just want to rotate it and, get it on a side-scrolling kind of view. I'm going to escape. Now, if we come back into our character controller again, I press Control Space if you don't have it docked. So open up our Blueprint SSCharacter, and now we want to go into the viewport, this tab up here. The viewport is just a way that we can visualize all the different components on our character. So any of you who are familiar with Unity, you might remember add a component and you have a mesh component and all this other stuff. Same concept. If not, all you just need to know is that this is just functionality that is added onto our SSCharacter. So our capsule, our an arrow so that we know what direction we're facing, a mesh, a camera, and so forth. And really, we just want to mess with the camera in this case so that we can customize that and get it to be positioned exactly where we want. So if I scroll down here, you'll see camera boom. If you select that inside the viewport, I'm holding down the right mouse button and using WASD controls to move around while I hold down right mouse button. Just like a first-person shooter, I guess. Q and E are moving up and down too, if I have not talked about that yet. So this is our camera. And right now, our camera is locked behind the player. If I want to rotate it, you may try to hit E and rotate it like this, but you'll notice that it's not really letting you do that. The reason is because there are some settings in here that are preventing that from happening. So the first thing we need to do is turn off those settings. If you go to camera settings, there's something called use pawn control rotation. I'm going to uncheck all of these. I don't really want to inherit any of these. I want to set the camera position and then have it just follow the player around, which is just going to be using the standard inheritance down here. Right. So if our character moves, because it's attached to the character, the capsule component, it will just inherit the position of that movement. So we don't really need to do some extra inheritance with the rotations here. So once you have these unchecked, you should be able to rotate the camera around. So what I want to do is I want to rotate it here to 90, or to -90, I guess, so that we're looking directly to the side of the character so that then it'll follow the player around as it moves in the level. Now remember, blue is forward direction for our character. So we should be looking at the character like that in a side scroller, camera, just like this, and we can hit compile, hit save, minimize, hit play. So obviously our character inputs are kind of wacky and we can move all around. We haven't even dealt with the character inputs yet in the movement. For now, it's just the camera, but the camera is moving how we want it to. It's just very, very close. So the next thing is, how do we move the camera back? Well, if you come back inside of the blueprint again, if you click on the camera boom, another thing that this is called is the spring arm component. It's renamed camera boom, but that is what it's called, is the spring arm component. If you want to find more information about that, the spring arm component allows us to give some extra functionality to how a camera moves. And right now, the spring arm component has a defined length right here, this red line. We want to move that further out, right? We want our camera to be way further back here. So this is the target arm length on the spring arm component that is called camera boom. So select that over here in target arm length. Let's put this something like 900, hit compile and save, minimize, hit play. All right, so now you can see it's further back. Again, our character movement is really weird, but that looks a little closer to what I want. So the other thing that I'm noticing is that this is very direct. Like my character stays precisely in the middle of the screen. Maybe you want that. Many side scrollers would do that. But I just wanted to show you that if you wanted a little bit of camera lag, you could actually get that inside of the spring arm component. Let's go back in. And this is going to be called camera lag if you want to set this. So if you scroll down to lag with this spring arm component selected, if you select enable camera lag, then you'll be able to control some of this. You can hover over any of these to see some tooltips. Now, the higher this number for camera lag speed, the more it's going to just directly follow the player. So if we were to put this down at 1, just to show you what this would look like, and hit compile and save, go back in, hit play. And so for me, I'm pressing W and S. You see how the camera lags way behind, and we really can't see what's in front of the player. We don't really want that much lag. For me, I just want it to be kind of subtle. So what I've found is to pick a number between 1 and 10 is usually pretty good. 10 is pretty instant. So I'm going to choose 5 and see what that looks like. But I remember previously from testing that this worked pretty well. Compile, save, minimize, hit play. And I'm going to click in here and press W and S. There's a little bit of lag. It's not instant, but it's pretty close. I think I do want it to be subtle. So when I stop, you see that little deceleration right there. Yeah. I think that's what I want. So I'm going to keep that there. But that's where you would actually control that. And the last thing that I want to do related to the camera is called the collision, the camera collision. Now, this is not going to be very obvious, but when I start decorating my level later on, if there is anything between the camera and the character that it's looking at on the spring arm component, by default, it will actually move the camera forward in front of whatever that collision thing is. So if we had a wall right here, our camera would instantly hop in if it was trying to do a line trace to the camera to the player and something got in between, it would hop in and make sure that it can still see the player, but it'll kind of like jump forward and jump back if there's anything here. And maybe we do want some walls and things in the foreground here. So anyways, I want to disable this for now inside of a side-scrolling component or inside of a side scroller. So I'm going to scroll down, or rather scroll up to camera collision over here. For camera collision, I actually want to disable this. And so when I disable this, I know that I can actually put things in front of the player in a side scroller. So I can hide them behind bushes and make some little secret compartments or whatever. I don't want the camera to do weird collisions and move around. I just want to have this set. So I'm going to disable the do collision test right there. Compile, save. And I think that that's all I want to do for the camera. You can see that our character movement is pretty weird still. So we'll tackle that next. But for now, the camera's moving about the distance that I want. It has some subtle lag, and it is at the projection that I want with the wall and the floor. Okay, so we have our character, and if we hit play, we're moving around, and our inputs are not really matching a side-scrolling style input because our WS is going side to side, but we want our A and D. Now, in order to fix this, we actually have to talk about the new enhanced input that Unreal is using. But the other thing we want to do is we want to lock the player character's movement to a plane because we just want to guarantee that they're not going into the background. Obviously you can do different things in different types of side scrollers, but in this case, I just want to lock it to a plane just for simplicity. So I'm gonna hit Control Space to open up my content browser. I'm gonna go to my character, not that one, the one in the SS game. There we go. Remember, we deleted out the camera input. So you're gonna see some things inside your blueprint. We'll mess with this in a second, but the first thing I wanna do is I wanna go over to my blueprint, SSCharacter, just click on the root up here. And if you type in the details, we're gonna type in planar. And this will lock our movement to a plane, which in this case is what we want. Again, depends on your game type. But I'm going to click the constrain to plane, this little checkbox right here. And then there's one other thing I want to do. Actually, I'm going to set both these. Snap to plane at start, just make sure that we are moving on that plane when we first begin. And then plane constraint axis setting, we just want to say what axis are we constraining? I'm going to select Y. All right, so with those three things right here, if I compile and I save, I come back in and I hit the play button. Okay, our input is still kind of messed up. You see we're doing WS, but we notice if we hit A and D, we can't really move into the background or into the foreground. So this is a step forward. Now I just need to fix my W and S and make sure that that is A and D, which is what I actually want. So I'm gonna leave that. I'm gonna come back in, and now once I open up my blueprint, I want to explain briefly the enhanced input system. Their new input system uses an action system instead of an old like input inside the project settings. Like if I go back over here and I go to edit project settings, you may not even see this depending on how far in the future, but if you go down to input, it says that it's deprecated and you can do a lot of things in here, but really we're going to do the new system. So I just want to show you that if you're in an older version, it might be in there, but if you don't even see it, I mean, even better. So I'm going to hit Control Space, come down to third person input. There's a couple different things that build into this new input system. One is my data asset called an input mapping context. If I open this up, you're going to see that there's something called mappings here. These are the different actions that we can create and assign to a character or something that receives input. And you can see we can customize all this right here. But what if we want to create a new action? Now, in our case, we don't really need to in our side scroller, but I just want to show you the idea of moving is an input action that we define somewhere else that we are plugging into a map. So our map is all the different actions that this character can take. So I'm going to close this out. Now I'm going to come back into my content browser again. I'm going to go inside the actions. So in our actions, we can actually create new actions if we want, right? Like we can, right click and create that or whatever, but we already have some created inside of the template. So one action is jumping. So if I open up jump, you'll see the action here and it's specifying, well, what is a jump and how are we triggering that? We're creating this generic action that then we can configure further. Same thing with our movement. If we go over here, right, move. This is kind of like the framework of what the action is. Like, is it accepting a Boolean? Is it accepting an XY, like I guess on a vector 2? What is the type of action that we're processing here? And again, this can get more complicated. We're not going to do anything special. We're just going to keep all the defaults. Just wanted to kind of talk through this a little bit. So if we wanted a new action to our character, let's say swing sword or attack or dash or whatever, we would have to create a new action to set this up. Then we would plug it into the map. We would configure this inside of our map. So if we expand here back in our map, which is where we hold all our actions, we can see on keyboard it's spacebar, on gamepad it's whatever it is on gamepad. So let me open up move. You'll see that on move, we are processing a lot of different inputs to get one output value, which is what we're going to use. Now you don't need to understand all this. You just need to kind of like see the context of, how it's being used. All you really need to know is that we have an action called move, and we are going to get an X and a Y value that it's using by, am I holding A and W or just W or S or D or whatever? And really, we're going to just receive an AD input, and we are going to do something based off that. So anyways, just to recap all this, our actions that are inside of our map, and then inside of our map, we are actually just defining what are the buttons that we are receiving to do this. So anyways, that's our context. And so if I go back into my blueprint over here, this add input mapping up here is actually pretty important. All this is doing is this is assigning our context, remember our action map, it is assigning our context to our player controller that then we can use to receive input. So this is just assigning our action map to this player controller. So we actually need all this. And then we can define which action map we want to assign right here, but this is the default one, which is what we were just looking at, which one of those things inside of this action map was movement. So once we've done this down here, this is just listening to the movement action inside of that action map. So again, that's all like a much larger tutorial, but for now, all you need to understand is that, we are listening to that action map, we are listening to the movement, and then we can do things. So if we listen to the X movement inside of that action, that is going to be our A and D. If we listen to Y, that is going to be our W and S. We actually don't want forward and backward, right? That's going to be our vertical, our Y. So we don't really need that. So I'm going to go over here and I'm just going to delete this out because we want our left and right. I'm going to delete that over there too. because we just want our X for our side scroller. If this is a top down, you might want more than that, but we just need our X in this type of game. And this is doing some additional things that we don't really need for a side scroller. We're just going to go in world space just to keep things very simple. So I'm going to delete these two nodes out right there as well. This is called a reroute node. We're going to delete this and delete that and just plug this back in. So this is action value X, plug this in to scale value. All this is doing is saying if it's 0, we're not going to move at all. Anything times 0 is 0. So 1 times a direction is just the direction. So let's just redo that right there. So what we were doing is we're listening to move, and we are receiving the value X from our movement, which remember is an X and a Y, but we only care about the X, which is our side to side, which is our A and our D. So if we press A, it's going to be -1. If we press D, it's going to be 1. We want to know what direction to move our character. We want to move in the X direction. So if I go to X and I hit 1, so what this means is that inside of our view, if we are moving in -1 direction, that's going to be to the left. If we're moving in +1 direction on our X, that's going to be to the right. Long story short, if we press A, we're going to move in -1. If we press D, we're going to move in +1x. Hopefully that makes sense. Character movement can be kind of weird and confusing, but if we hit compile, hit save, and I think that'll be it. Let's test it out. Hit play. All right, so we can see we're actually moving in left and right with our A and D, and if we press W and X, it's not really doing anything, right? Just our A and D, which is exactly what we want, which is awesome. So I know the new input system is there's extra steps. It's actually more modular and that we can add and remove actions without having to mess with a lot of other things and create errors. But it is a little bit to kind of like wrap your head around at first. But this is the short version of just how it works, but really what we need to do to make our side scroller. Okay, now let's talk about rotation speed. So if I hit the play button, see right here how my character rotates left and right. But if I want to turn around really quickly, it's a little sluggish, right? Like it just feels very heavy, and I may not want that feel. Maybe some of you might want that, and that's fine, but I would just want to show you how you could change that if you wanted to make it feel a little bit more snappy. So I'm going to open up my blueprint character again. So if I click on my SSCharacter up here and I search for rotation, you're going to see some other things down here, but what we're looking for is something called the rotation rate. So if I scroll down right here, under character movement, we have 0, 0, 500. This is how quickly it's going to rotate on which axis when it's trying to move a direction. So what I want to do is I want to just bump this number up. And I think maybe 900, maybe 1,000, something like that would be fine, depending on how fast you want it to rotate. So this is going to feel a lot snappier. Actually, let's do 1,000. We'll hit compile and hit save, and we'll hop back in, hit play. Okay, and now it's a lot snappier. We could bump that even more if we want, right? Like you keep pulling it upwards and upwards if you want it to feel very snappy, right? Like you could really go 10,000, just add a 0. It's gonna feel pretty near instant, right? I've also found that if you put -1, it's instant as well. But, I don't know if that's going to cause other issues. So you could just bump that as high or as low as you want it. I'm going to keep mine at 1,000. I like a little bit of sluggishness. So the last thing we need to talk about is making our jump feel better. And there's a couple different settings we can use to do this. So if I jump right now, it's kind of low. Like it's not very high for a platformer. It's also very kind of floaty, especially when we factor in our rotation. So let me show you how you can adjust that to how you want. So if I go back to my blueprint over here, I'm going to select my character movement component down here. And you're going to see a lot of extra options. I'm only going to talk about the major ones just to get you started and let you tweak the major ones, but you can fine tune all this stuff if you want. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to search for jump Z velocity. This is how high I want to jump. Before we jump not very high, I'm just going to bump this up slightly. I actually want 800. Compile, save, and let's see what that looks like. All right, I think that's good. In some games, you might jump even higher than that, but this feels about right to me. Okay, now for the floatiness, I want to show you that. The floatiness is caused by not breaking in midair. So if I back out of here, what I'm looking for here is braking deceleration by falling. You can see all of our other jump settings. I probably just should have filtered this, but either way, braking deceleration by falling, this is how much we want to slow our movement just by falling, whether or not we're pressing the input. So for example, if I put 500 here, it's default to 0, so we're just going to carry on our acceleration, but we want to brake while we're falling if we're not pressing anything. So 500 is the amount we're braking. So if I hit play and do this again, you see if I let go of my key, how I slow down, which may allow us to fine tune our, where we're landing on a platform below us, but we still maintain our full acceleration if we hold down the key. So that's kind of nice, right? So I just want to be able to let go and not continue moving. So we'll keep that. Again, you can further fine tune this if you want. Air control is the other one that I think is worth mentioning. So air control is the percentage of control we want while we're in midair. So in other words, 0.35 will be 35%. We had 35% control while we're in midair. I actually want full control in this particular game. I like the snappiness of it, but if you only wanted partial control, you could bump that to 0.7. Anything between 0 to 1 would be fine. I'm gonna leave it at 1 and show you. Compile, save, go back, hit play. And so it's very snappy now. And combined with our deceleration, I think this feels pretty good for my platformer. Again, you can tweak even more of the settings there. I just want to show you the major ones. Poke around, try some stuff, but I think this feels pretty good for the general jumping for our character controller. Okay, and the last thing I wanted to mention is over here, if you click the blueprint SSCharacter self over here at the very top. If you scroll down here under character, some of you might want varied jump heights. So if you barely tap the spacebar, you want to jump a little bit. But if you hold down the spacebar, you want to jump a lot. I've changed mine to 0.3. And this just allows us to continue to add jump force while we hold down the button. So what this means is if you add a max hold time, you'll probably need to also go back under the character movement. And if we type in jumping, come back over here, and you will probably need to turn this down a little bit because we want to continue to add it while we hold down the button. So you want that to be a slightly smaller amount. So basically determine the minimum jump height you want, and then determine the maximum jump height by changing this value and clear my field over here, and this value over here on the self under character right here. You can also add, multiple jumps if you like, but I didn't do that. I just added 0.3 for max hold time, and then 500 jump height was what allowed me to get this effect right here. Don't worry about that extra character over there. This future video. So we can do a minimum jump, and then we can do a maximum jump. So if you want that effect, that's where you would find that. It's a little tricky. It's just on the character, right? The character self, rather than the character movement. So I wanted to point that out for you all. And with that, I think we have our basic character with our jumping. You might hear some sounds, which I'll do in a later video, and I'm kind of adding this on because I forgot to clarify this. But you can see we can move around, we can jump high, we can jump low, we can slightly slow our speed while we jump. We have some air control, we have some rotations. And this is overall, this is how you can set up a really basic side-scrolling platformer from the third-person character template that we get provided with Unreal. So thank you for following along, and hopefully you're able to continue to build off of this into some cool new projects. So thank you.